It was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed about. A stretch of tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and mailboxes decorated with flowers. Kids played basketball in the cul-de-sac. Dogs barked lazily at passing cars, and porch lights glowed like quiet guardians of peace. Nothing ever really happened on Maple Drive. People left their doors unlocked, barbecues were shared every Sunday, and neighbors knew each other by name. The air smelled of trust and routine, but even the safest places hide shadows. And behind the pale blue house at the end of the street, something unthinkable had been festering for years, unnoticed, hidden behind smiles and morning greetings. Thomas Avery had lived there for more than a decade. He was in his mid-40s, single, clean-cut, and polite in a way that made people feel instantly comfortable. He wore neat khaki pants, tucked shirts, and always had that calm tone that made you trust him. He helped mow lawns for elderly neighbors, handed out candy at Halloween, and joined the yearly street fair. No one had a single bad thing to say about him. Some called him too quiet, but in a world full of noisy people, quiet was comforting. When he smiled, it reached his eyes, or at least that's what everyone thought. There was something oddly meticulous about the way he lived. His lawn was trimmed in perfect rows, his car always spotless, and his garbage bins neatly aligned on collection day. He didn't socialize much, but when he did, he listened more than he spoke. He had a way of making people feel like their stories mattered. He was the man people trusted with their spare keys when they went on vacation. The man who'd feed their pets, water their plants, and make sure everything stayed just as they left it. Everyone thought they knew him. No one really did. The first hint that something was wrong came on a humid afternoon in July. The air was thick, heavy with summer heat, when a strange smell began drifting across Maple Drive. At first, it was faint, almost like spoiled food left too long in the trash. Neighbors noticed but brushed it off. Maybe an animal had died somewhere nearby. By the next day, the odor had grown stronger, sour, metallic, and sickly sweet all at once. People began closing their windows, lighting scented candles, spraying air fresheners. Still, the stench clung to the air, following every breeze like a curse. It was Mrs. Collins, the retired school teacher who lived next door, who finally called the police. She told them she couldn't sleep because of the smell, that she'd seen flies gathering around Avery's garage door. When the patrol car pulled up, 2 officers stepped out, expecting to find a dead raccoon or a leaking trash bin. They knocked on the front door, but no one answered. Avery's car sat neatly in the driveway. The house looked peaceful, curtains drawn, porch swept clean. When the officers walked around back, they saw the small detached garage, its white paint peeling slightly near the roof. The smell hit them before they even reached it. They tried the door, it was locked. One of the officers tapped on the metal, and a dull echo came back. He frowned, noticing a faint hum from inside like the steady whir of an old appliance. They called for backup and waited, pacing in the thick heat. When Avery finally appeared, walking calmly up the driveway carrying groceries, the officers were almost relieved. They explained the complaint, that there might be something dead in the garage. Avery smiled politely, as if embarrassed by the fuss, and said he'd open it right away. He pulled a small ring of keys from his pocket, hesitated for a moment, just a second too long, and then unlocked the door. The smell that poured out was so overpowering that one officer had to step back, covering his mouth. Inside, the garage was dim and strangely cold. There was a freezer in the corner, old and dented, its sides coated with frost. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering softly. The officers exchanged glances, unsure what they were about to find. Avery stood still, his expression unreadable. When they lifted the lid of the freezer, the hum of the motor mixed with the sound of their own breathing. Then one of them froze. What he saw didn't make sense at first. Black plastic bags, carefully wrapped, each tied with thick duct tape. Inside one of the bags was something pale, something unmistakably human. The younger officer stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The other shouted for Avery to step aside, but Avery didn't move. His face remained perfectly calm, almost serene, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He simply whispered, "You shouldn't have opened it," and looked away. Within minutes, the scene exploded into chaos. More units arrived, sirens echoing down the quiet street. Neighbors came out of their homes, confused and frightened, watching as police swarmed the once peaceful property. What they found inside that freezer made even the most seasoned detectives go silent. There were multiple bags, each labeled neatly with small white tags written in Avery's precise handwriting. Every tag had a name, a date, and sometimes a location. Some names were familiar. People who had gone missing over the years, whose faces had once been printed on posters and local news bulletins. A teenage girl who vanished walking home from school. A young man who disappeared after a late shift. A woman whose car was found abandoned miles away. All unsolved, all forgotten until now. As the crime scene tape went up, the quiet street of Maple Drive became a sea of flashing red and blue. Reporters crowded outside the barricades, shouting questions. Neighbors huddled together, whispering in disbelief. Some cried openly, others just stared. Nobody could comprehend how the man they waved to every morning, the man who fed their cats and fixed their sprinklers, had been hiding bodies in his garage. Detectives searched the house from top to bottom. They found more clues. A small camera in his office, stacks of notebooks, maps with markings across several states. Each notebook was filled with detailed notes describing people, routines, and times of disappearance. It became clear that this wasn't an accident nor a moment of insanity. This had been years in the making, planned down to the smallest detail. Inside one of the drawers they found photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one showing different victims. Some alive, smiling, unaware of what was coming. Others less so. The sheer organization of everything sent chills down the spine of every investigator there. This wasn't the chaos of a madman. This was order, calculation, a predator who had perfected his craft under the mask of normality. When Thomas Avery was finally handcuffed and led out of the house, he didn't struggle or shout. He didn't say a word. He simply looked around at his neighbors, their faces pale and horrified, and gave a small, polite nod. It was the same quiet acknowledgement he'd given them for years. The same look that once meant safety, now meant something else entirely. Something monstrous. The wind carried the faint jingle of the wind chimes from his porch. The same ones everyone used to find comforting. Now that soft sound seemed to echo with dread. Maple Drive would never be the same again. The illusion of safety of normal life shattered in one night. For years, those who lived there would tell the story of that blue house. The one that looked so harmless, and the man who lived inside. A man who reminded everyone that true evil doesn't always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile, lives next door, and waves at you every morning. By the time the police had secured the scene, the entire neighborhood was engulfed in disbelief. Flashing lights painted the quiet street red and blue, and yellow tape fluttered in the thick summer air like a warning to stay away from what no one could yet fully understand. People stood in clusters at the ends of their driveways, whispering, crying, clutching each other as if to make sure they were still awake. The man who had fixed their mailboxes and smiled at their children was being led out in handcuffs, his expression calm, almost detached. Some neighbors shouted questions at him, desperate for an explanation, but he didn't respond. His face remained eerily blank, eyes fixed on something distant. When one of the officers placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him into the car, Avery turned his head slightly and said, almost politely, "Be careful with the garage door. It sticks." That single sentence sent a wave of unease through everyone who heard it. Inside the house, detectives moved methodically from room to room, documenting every inch of the spotless interior. It was a strange contrast. The house looked ordinary, cozy even. A faint smell of lemon cleaner lingered in the air. The furniture was neatly arranged and not a speck of dust could be found. On the surface, it looked like the home of a man with good habits and quiet routines. But as investigators dug deeper, they started finding things that didn't belong. In the kitchen, a drawer that should have held utensils instead contained small sealed envelopes, each with a single item: a ring, a locket, a keychain. On the back of each envelope there was a date written in Avery's careful handwriting. In the living room, the bookshelf held rows of neatly labeled binders. At first they looked like photo albums, but when the officers opened one, the photographs inside weren't family pictures. They were of strangers, some smiling, others caught off guard, all of them later confirmed to be missing persons. Each album seemed to document an entire life, ending abruptly with an empty space at the back of the binder. It was as if Avery had tried to preserve their existence, organizing his victims like a twisted archivist cataloging his own legacy. Down in the basement, things grew darker. There were shelves filled with tools, but not the kind meant for home repairs. There were saws, ropes, gloves, chemicals, and rolls of plastic wrap. Everything was arranged neatly, labeled, cleaned after use. It wasn't a scene of chaos or madness. It was one of precision. Avery hadn't been improvising. He had been planning, preparing, executing, and documenting everything for years. On one of the tables lay a small notebook, its cover worn and corners creased. Inside were meticulous notes, dates, times, names, locations. He described how he met his victims, what he told them, how long it took for them to trust him. It read like a diary written by someone completely devoid of empathy. Detectives noticed that many of his victims had one thing in common. They were all people who had once needed help. A woman whose car broke down on a dark road, a teenage boy who needed a ride home, a man who was new in town and asked for directions. Every story began with an act of kindness. He had built his camouflage perfectly by being the man people could depend on. That was his weapon, the trust of others. Word spread quickly through the town and then across the state. Within hours, media vans lined Maple Drive, reporters shoving microphones toward anyone willing to talk. The footage of Avery being escorted into the police car replayed endlessly on television. The story of the killer next door became a national obsession. How could someone so ordinary commit acts so monstrous? The question echoed in every interview, every headline, every online comment. Neighbors began to recount their memories of him to reporters. Mrs. Collins, her eyes red and trembling, told them about the time he had helped her fix a broken fence, how gentle and patient he had been. Another neighbor said he had shared tools with Avery, even had coffee with him a few times. He was quiet but good, the man said, shaking his head as if trying to wake from a dream. I can't believe I didn't see it. A young mother broke down as she recalled how Avery had once watched her daughter for an afternoon when she was sick. She kept repeating, he played dolls with her. He made her laugh. How could he? The horror of the truth was too big to process. It wasn't just the discovery of the bodies. It was the betrayal of trust that cut deepest. As police continued their search, they uncovered more evidence that deepened the nightmare. Hidden behind a false wall in Avery's study was a small locked room, barely large enough for one person. Inside, the air was thick and stale. There was a single chair, a small table, and a video camera mounted on a tripod. On the table sat an old cassette recorder, several used tapes, and a stack of photographs. Some of the tapes were labeled, others were blank. When detectives played one, the sound that came out made even the most experienced officer go pale. It was Avery's voice, calm and steady, speaking to someone unseen. You're safe now, he said. No one's going to hurt you anymore. The voice on the tape, a woman's, was trembling, confused, asking to go home. Then there was silence, followed by the soft hum of the camera turning off. It became evident that Avery had recorded parts of his crimes not for pleasure, but as a record of his control, as if proving to himself that he was in command. The discovery added a new layer of horror to the case. He wasn't impulsive or erratic. He was deliberate. Everything he did had purpose. When Avery was questioned at the police station, detectives expected denial or excuses. Instead, he was eerily cooperative. He answered questions clearly, even politely, but he never showed guilt. He described his actions like a man explaining a technical process. When asked why he did it, he paused for a long moment before replying, "Because I could. Because no one ever looks too closely at the people who seem normal." That sentence was enough to silence the room. One detective later said he had never felt such a chill from another human being. Avery spoke about his victims as if they were objects in a collection, not people. He described their routines, how easily they trusted him, how simple it was to become invisible in their lives. He admitted to studying people for months before approaching them, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked day and night on the house. Every inch of the property was examined. In the garden, beneath the roses that everyone admired, police dogs found bones. In the attic, they found an old trunk filled with letters written but never sent, addressed to the families of his victims. Some of them expressed sympathy, written in neat cursive pretending to be from anonymous well-wishers. It was a grotesque attempt at playing both sides, killer and comforter. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that Thomas Avery was not just a murderer. He was a master manipulator who had built an entire life around deception. He understood human behavior better than most. He knew when to smile, when to offer help, when to step back and vanish. His greatest disguise had been kindness. When the news reached the families of his victims, the grief was overwhelming. Many had long given up hope of ever finding out what happened to their loved ones. Now they were faced with a truth worse than anything they could have imagined. Candlelight vigils were held. People prayed, cried, and demanded to know how someone could have hidden in plain sight for so long. Experts began analyzing his case, calling him one of the most dangerous kinds of killers. The kind who doesn't need to hide because his normalcy is his shield. As night fell over Maple Drive that second day, the blue house stood in silence, its windows dark, the lawn empty. The hum of the freezer had stopped, the electricity cut off. The air still carried traces of decay and bleach. The wind chimes swayed gently, ringing faintly like the echo of a secret finally exposed. People who had once passed that house without a second thought now crossed the street to avoid it. Every friendly face suddenly felt suspicious. Every neighbor's wave was now a question. Who really lives next door? That thought haunted the town long after the flashing lights faded, long after the cameras left. What once was a peaceful street had become a place where innocence was murdered by familiarity, and where kindness had worn the mask of evil. The courtroom was packed to the walls on the first day of the trial. People had come from miles away to witness the man the media had dubbed America's most shocking neighbor. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras flashing as Thomas Avery was escorted to his seat. He wore the same calm expression he had the night of his arrest, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his posture straight, his eyes forward. There was no fear, no regret, no hint of emotion. The world was watching him, waiting for him to break, to show something, anything that resembled humanity. But he never did. He sat there silent, like a statue carved from ice. The families of the victims filled the front rows, clutching framed photographs, some too overcome with emotion to speak. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers clenched their fists. Siblings stared at Avery with eyes full of hatred and disbelief. Every single one of them had spent years wondering what had happened to the people they loved. Now the answer was sitting right in front of them, wearing a beige prison uniform, looking almost ordinary. The ordinariness was what made it worse. There was nothing monstrous in his appearance, no wildness in his eyes, no visible darkness. He looked like someone's teacher, someone's accountant, someone you'd meet in line at the grocery store. That was what haunted people most. The prosecutor opened the case with photographs, the kind that made jurors avert their eyes. Then came the evidence. The notebooks, the tapes, the photographs, the tagged items found in his home. Every piece painted the same picture. one of deliberate, cold-blooded calculation. They explained how Avery had studied his victims, how he followed them, how he approached with kindness, offering help or conversation, slowly weaving himself into their lives before striking. Each step was documented in his own words, written in that same careful, steady handwriting that had labeled every bag, every tag, every page. When the prosecution played the audio tapes recovered from his basement, the courtroom went still. Avery's voice filled the room, smooth and emotionless. The words he spoke were ordinary, almost comforting, but the tone was chilling because it was detached, as if he were narrating a story rather than describing the moments leading up to murder. On one of the tapes, he could be heard speaking to one of his victims, telling her she was safe, that she just had to trust him. The prosecutor paused the recording there, allowing the silence to sit heavy in the room before saying, he wanted them to believe he was their protector. He wanted them to feel safe, right up until the end. Throughout it all, Avery never flinched. His lawyer occasionally whispered to him, but he rarely responded. When the defense tried to argue that he suffered from mental illness, the psychiatrists disagreed. One after another, the experts testified that Thomas Avery knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't confused. He was rational, aware, and driven by something deeper, an obsession with control, with playing God over life and death. He chose his victims not at random, but carefully, based on how easy it was to gain their trust. Detectives testified about the moment they entered the garage, describing the stench, the discovery of the freezer, the precise arrangement of remains. One officer said he would never forget the smell, that it had clung to his clothes and his mind for weeks. Another spoke about the eerie calmness in Avery's voice when he told them they shouldn't have opened the lid. Every word built a story of someone who had hidden his darkness so perfectly that no one had ever suspected him. When it was time for Avery to take the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready, and family members sat rigid, bracing for whatever horror he might reveal. His attorney asked him if he wanted to say anything about the charges. Avery simply smiled faintly and said, "People see what they want to see. I didn't hide. I lived among them and they never looked. That's not my fault." The judge immediately ordered him to answer questions directly, but that one sentence had already sunk deep into everyone's mind. The prosecutor asked him if he felt any remorse for the people he killed. He tilted his head slightly as if thinking about it and replied, "I think remorse is a social construct. I didn't enjoy it, if that's what you're asking. It was necessary." The courtroom erupted, people shouting, crying, cursing his name, but Avery remained perfectly calm. Even as the judge demanded silence, he sat there untouched by the chaos around him. When pressed to explain what he meant by necessary, he gave an answer that would later be quoted across every major news outlet. Because no one deserves the comfort of feeling safe all the time. It makes them weak. I wanted to show them the truth, that danger doesn't always wear a mask. For weeks, the trial continued. Every day brought new evidence, new testimonies, new horrors. Former co-workers spoke of him as quiet and polite. Neighbors described him as trustworthy, and his employer said he had never missed a day of work. The duality of his life fascinated and terrified the public. How could a man maintain such perfect normalcy while committing unspeakable acts in secret? Psychologists on television debated theories about sociopathy, compartmentalization, and the illusion of normality. But none of the explanations felt satisfying because none of them could undo what he had done. The jury listened horrified as the details unfolded. They saw photographs from his house, the hidden room, the notebooks, the collection of souvenirs. They watched clips from his interrogations, where he spoke about his crimes like a scientist explaining an experiment. The hardest part wasn't the act itself, he said in one clip. It was pretending to be normal afterward, smiling at people, waving, talking about the weather, but I learned to enjoy it. It made the game more interesting." That line became infamous. It appeared on magazine covers, documentaries, podcasts. It became a haunting reminder of how evil can wear the face of ordinary kindness. Some even began comparing Avery to historical serial killers, though many experts said he was different. His crimes weren't about rage or revenge. They were about curiosity, control, and the thrill of deception. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as enlightened, someone who had stripped away the illusions of morality that kept others in denial. By the time closing arguments began, there was no question of guilt. The only question was whether the jury would sentence him to death or life imprisonment. The prosecutor's final statement was brief but powerful. She looked directly at Avery and said, "You hid in plain sight because you thought you were smarter than the rest of us. But the truth is you were only ever ordinary. A coward who took lives because it made him feel significant." Avery didn't respond. He just smiled, that same polite smile that had once fooled an entire neighborhood. When the verdict was read, guilty on 17 counts of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion. Some cheered, others sobbed, and a few simply sat in stunned silence. The families of the victims clung to one another, finding a small measure of peace in the justice delivered. Avery didn't flinch. He stood, nodded to the judge, and walked calmly out of the courtroom surrounded by guards. To him it seemed none of it mattered. In the days that followed, the story dominated every news outlet. Documentaries were produced, interviews aired, and Maple Drive became synonymous with hidden evil. The town's once proud reputation as a safe, friendly community was gone. Real estate prices plummeted, people moved away, and the Blue House stood empty, its windows boarded, its lawn overgrown. The wind chimes that had once played soft music now clattered in the wind like bones. But one detail from the trial continued to haunt everyone long after it ended. Avery's words on the stand. People see what they want to see. It became a terrifying truth about human nature. Everyone on Maple Drive had seen what they wanted to. A good man, a neighbor, a friend. And in doing so, they had allowed a monster to live among them, unnoticed, unchallenged, until it was too late. The courtroom closed, the cameras turned off, but the lesson lingered. A warning whispered through every quiet neighborhood in America that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't live in shadows. They live right next door. The day of Thomas Avery's sentencing was one that the entire country seemed to stop and watch. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered long before sunrise. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, microphones raised high, waiting for a glimpse of the man whose name had become synonymous with horror. Inside, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The families of his victims sat in the front row again, clutching photos, some whispering prayers, others staring at the empty defense chair with trembling hands. There was a strange stillness in the air, a sense that this moment, this verdict, might finally close a wound that had scarred an entire town. But no one could have predicted the way it would end. When Avery was brought into the courtroom, the room fell silent. He wore the same faint smile he had worn every day of the trial, as if he were attending a casual hearing, not the conclusion of one of the most horrifying murder cases in modern American history. His hair was neatly combed, his expression calm, his eyes steady. He looked around the room as though he were scanning faces, memorizing them, absorbing their pain. A few family members couldn't bear to look at him and turned away. Others glared with a mixture of grief and rage, waiting for him to meet their gaze so they could see even the smallest flicker of regret. None came. The judge entered and everyone rose. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sharp and final. "We are here today to deliver sentencing in the case of Thomas Avery," the judge said, her voice steady but laced with tension. The clerk read through the charges again. 17 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of human remains. Each charge carried its own weight. Each name that followed a ghost resurrected in the room for one last time. When the clerk finished, there was a pause so long that it felt like the air itself stopped moving. Before the sentence could be delivered, Avery's attorney stood and said his client wished to make a statement. The request sent a murmur through the crowd. The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All eyes turned to Avery as he rose slowly to his feet. He adjusted the collar of his prison uniform, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "I've listened to everything that's been said about me," he said, his voice calm and even, echoing across the hushed room. "People have called me a monster, a psychopath, a predator. Maybe they're right. But I think what scares you most is that I was none of those things before I decided to be." A few gasps rippled through the room. He looked directly at the families of his victims. "I lived among you. I smiled at you. You invited me into your homes. I didn't hide behind shadows. I just paid attention, and you never noticed." The judge tried to interrupt, but he kept speaking, his tone eerily composed. "You think locking me away will make you safe again? It won't, because I wasn't born different. I'm just what happens when people stop looking closely. You trust too easily. You assume kindness means good. But evil doesn't always announce itself, it just waits." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm not the only one. There are others. They're everywhere. You just haven't looked close enough." A collective shiver passed through the courtroom. People began murmuring, some crying, others yelling for him to stop. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order, but the words had already landed. They would echo far beyond that room, haunting every neighborhood, every town, every person who had ever believed they were safe. Avery didn't look shaken or triumphant. He simply smiled faintly, like a teacher satisfied with a final lesson learned. Then he sat back down, folding his hands neatly on the table as if his work there was finished. The judge, maintaining her composure, finally delivered the sentence. "Thomas Avery, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. May you never again walk free among decent, innocent people." Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke the last words. There was a brief applause from the families, followed by tears, some of relief, some of grief, and some of confusion over whether justice could ever truly feel complete after what he had done. Avery nodded politely at the judge, then turned to the officers who moved to escort him away. He didn't resist. He didn't even look back. As he passed by the victims' families, he whispered something too quietly for most to hear. Only one woman caught it. Later, she would tell reporters that he had said, "You'll remember me every time you meet someone new." The moment he was gone, the room seemed to exhale. Reporters rushed out to broadcast his final words. Within hours, news channels across the country were playing his statement on repeat. "There are others. They're everywhere." Those 6 words set off a storm of paranoia. Talk shows, podcasts, and online forums exploded with speculation. People began revisiting cold cases, wondering if Avery's crimes were connected to others. Every missing person report was suddenly viewed through the lens of his confession. But more than that, his words planted a seed of fear in ordinary lives. People started looking at their neighbors differently. Friendly smiles felt unsettling. Kind gestures seemed suspicious. America, for a time, lost its trust in the ordinary. In Brookville, Maple Drive no longer resembled the picture-perfect street it once was. The blue house where Avery had lived became a macabre landmark. Police tape had long been removed, but no one dared to buy it. Some nights, curious visitors would drive by slowly, their headlights cutting through the darkness just to catch a glimpse. Others claimed they could still smell something strange near the property, though it was long cleaned and gutted. The house stood empty for months before the city finally ordered it demolished. When the wrecking ball hit, the crowd that gathered to watch cheered, hoping that tearing it down would erase the nightmare. But even after the house was gone, the space it left behind felt cursed. No one ever rebuilt there. The lot remained an open patch of grass, fenced off with a simple sign that read, "Property closed." For those who had lived nearby, life never returned to normal. Every creak at night made them flinch. Every stranger's knock brought unease. Children who had once played freely on the street now stayed indoors. The sound of laughter was replaced by silence and suspicion. Mrs. Collins, the neighbor who had first called the police, moved away within months. She told a local reporter before she left, "I used to love hearing the wind chimes on summer nights. Now I can't stand the sound." In prison, Avery remained as composed as ever. He adjusted easily to the routine, reading books, writing letters, and rarely speaking to anyone. Guards described him as polite, eerily so. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice. Some inmates said he spent hours staring out the window of his cell, as if studying the world beyond the bars. When asked once by a psychologist if he ever thought about his victims, he replied, "Every day. They made me who I am." His lack of remorse became legendary. He gave one interview to a crime journalist a year into his sentence, during which he said, "People think I took lives because I wanted power. But really I wanted to see how far I could go before someone noticed. Turns out I went pretty far." Even after years passed, his story refused to fade. Documentaries, podcasts, books, all revisited the chilling case of the neighbor who had fooled everyone. Experts dissected his behavior, his psychology, his final words, trying to make sense of how someone so ordinary could hide such darkness. But perhaps the most disturbing thing was that Avery had achieved what he wanted most: to be remembered. Today, the lot where his house once stood remains untouched. The grass grows tall and wild, and no one mows it. At night, when the wind passes through, locals say you can hear the faint sound of wind chimes, though there's nothing there to make the sound. Some say it's the echo of what once was. Others say it's his reminder that evil never truly disappears, it just changes its shape. And every so often, when someone new moves to Brookville and asks why no one lives on that empty patch of land at the end of Maple Drive, the locals simply shake their heads. Because once, they say quietly, a man lived there who taught us that monsters don't hide in the dark. Sometimes they live next door. And with that, they turn away, leaving the question hanging in the still night air, just like the ghost of the man who had forever changed what it meant to feel safe.